Welcome to the Story Copywriter Podcast, the show that teaches you everything you need to know to write stories that sell and become the written voice of a business you love. With me, your host and founder of Story Copywriters, Rob Drummond. Hey, there's no new podcast episode this week because I'm buried in a client assignment. So what I'm going to do in this episode is reshare an interview that I did with Jonathan Wilson for my previous podcast, the Maze Marketing Podcast, where we talked about email storytelling. And actually revisiting this interview a couple of years later, nothing I have shared has gone out of date, which is the great thing about storytelling, because storytelling is a fundamental principle. It's not like teaching Google ads or Facebook ads where the interface changes, everything goes out of date. Everything that we're doing here will still be valid in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. So I wanted to share this interview. I drew up a lot of information in this interview. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to share the notes that we made, the detailed show notes for you as a listener free of charge. This interview actually sits quite nicely with where we're up to. So in the last episode, we were talking about the difference between core stories and current stories. And in the next new episode, we're going to move on and talk about the story map process. I mention a lot of these things in this interview. So this is actually going to be a good foundation, a good groundwork for the next episode where we'll talk about the story map process. Hopefully next week I'm not drowning under the weight of client work, and we'll move on and we'll talk about the story map process. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation between myself and Jonathan.
So Rob, I think from my outside perspective that one of your superpowers, as people like to say, is storytelling. You're a king storytelling marketer. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what that means to you and how it helps your clients?
Yeah, so I have like an interest in storytelling. Like I'm not. It's funny. Like I don't really consider myself like an out and out storyteller in the sort of extrovert, center of attention sort of way.
Yeah.
But so most of the stories that I tell are written. I think if you're sending a regular email column, or if you're sending a print newsletter, or if you're writing books or anything like that, then stories become really important. If it's a personal medium and you need to build trust with people over a longer period of time, then stories are probably the best way to do that. So one of the most common email sequences that I'll work on with a client is kind of the welcome series after people opt in.
Mm-hmm.
And in that series, often what we'll do is we'll try to tell the business owner's story, but in a way that presents them in sort of a vulnerable way. It allows people to get to know the real them. It showcases their flaws as well. And what I've sort of found by doing this is that the people who do engage with those emails, like they do stick around for a long period of time.
Yep.
It also means that they actually see you as unique, so that even if they're not ready to buy right now, when they are ready to buy, they want to work with you.
Yeah.
Because it's just the basis of how we build trust. So I've sort of had this kind of long running interest in stories, and actually, so English literature was one of the subjects that I did A levels at school.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember like I had a bunch of friends who were studying things like physics and chemistry and maths and so-called harder subjects, who were basically just laughing at me for doing an A level and reading books.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, on the face of it, that's true, but I knew that there was something more fundamental going on. Like I knew that it was important and I knew that it mattered. I just couldn't quite, when I was 18 or 17 or however old I was, I couldn't quite pinpoint yet what that thing was. And actually what that thing was is that the stories that we were studying, they were actually telling us fundamental truths about the human existence. They were trying to pass on knowledge. It's the oldest way of passing on knowledge. And I kind of had a sense of that without really sort of understanding it. And if you think about it in your marketing, if you're building trust with people, you're trying to do the same thing. You're trying to pass on knowledge. And most people, when you create an email series, try to pass on that knowledge by writing quite technical emails.
Mm-hmm.
So I distinguish in an email between story and content.
Yeah. So
content is the email that you would have sent if you don't include any story. It's the how-to, the mechanics. It's what we assume people want by catering to their logical brains, but it's not really how they make buying decisions. So if you think of a sandwich that has some filling in, so the filling is like the story, and there's all sorts of fillings that you can put on a sandwich, tasty fillings, varied fillings, all of that stuff. The content is like the bread. If you don't have any fillings on your sandwich, you're asking people to eat dry bread over and over and over and over. And you know what? I mean, they might eat dry bread like a few times if they're really desperate to work with you.
Yeah,
it can work, but it's working less and less. So if you need to say, if you have a potentially long buying cycle, or if you sell to the same person over a long period of time, potentially over multiple transactions, then this isn't really something to bolt onto your marketing. This is almost like the core thing that you need to put at the core of your marketing. It needs to be the story that sits at the heart of everything that you communicate about what you're doing.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the background. So I kind of started off self-employed life as an AdWords guy, and then I ended up doing some work in the email marketing system Aweber. So I was writing emails for both myself and for clients, and I've always written kind of story-based emails, and I always kind of assumed that it was kind of a bit of a dark art, and I couldn't really apply a system to it. Like I've always created systems for Google Ads and things like that, but I couldn't create a system for how to write a story-based email. And then a few years ago, I went to one of Sean D'Souza's workshops. So Sean is a marketer based in New Zealand, that he put on a storytelling workshop. And we all arrived at this workshop. So there's about 20 of us at the workshop, and we all arrived as writers in some sort. So a few copywriters, a few authors, a few other people, I guess. But it became very apparent very quickly that Sean did have a process he was able to teach, and it wouldn't have mattered if we'd all have arrived as, architects or engineers or chemistry students or whatever. Like we would all make the same mistakes and would have all emerged out of the course with the same skills.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of changed my entire thinking, because I realized that by applying some of Sean's ideas and combining them with some of my own ideas, I was able to kind of systematize it, and I was able to teach it. That isn't to say it's an easy system to follow. And the hardest part about it is being willing to be vulnerable. That's probably the hardest thing that people wrestle with. Like they worry. You worry when you tell a personal story that it's not going to be relevant to the buyer, that people are going to judge you, that it's going to distract them from buying. All of these things are only true in very, very specific circumstances. These things are only true if someone is literally ready to click the buy now button. If they're not ready to click the buy now button, then you need to be telling your story. And the more vulnerable you can be about it, the better.
Yeah. An interesting thing I think you're 100% right. I think that's probably the thing that concerns or worries people the most about telling their story. At the same time, this is kind of similar to something we've talked about when we had the episode describing your email list maintenance hygiene. You want people to see your angle, and if you are not for them, it'd be better for them to see that and unsubscribe, so to speak, from your message in the storytelling phase than after they become a client and all of a sudden they find out that you what? You're an Irish guy? I don't like Irishmen. I'm making that up, right? Just to tease you. But, whatever it is that you're afraid they may not like, if that was true, it'd be better if they went ahead and found that out about you anyway, early on, and skipped out on you. And then the people who like it, who are interested and find it intriguing, they can go ahead and soak it up and get to know you better.
People always see more commonalities in your story than you realize that they're going to.
Yeah.
Shared experiences, even if it's not exactly the same experience. Like, so my first email in my sort of course, in what I call my core story series, goes back to my earliest memory. And my earliest memory, or one of my earliest significant memories, is of my granddad dying. And I was there in the room. I was about 4 years old, and I remember it happening, but I wasn't old enough to understand it properly.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it's just quite a powerful story. But if you can introduce that sort of thing, like people always relate to that in some other context.
Yep.
It always triggers off some kind of association. I have quite a few emails in my series that talk about early jobs. And we thought, I think most of us have all had early jobs that, we wouldn't necessarily do anymore. And the stories that come out of that are the things that you get up to. I have stories that I tell about truanting off school to play snooker, which actually ties into the why I am today, because I still maintain that a degree of walking around on the face of it, not doing much work, is actually healthy for you as a writer, and healthy for your soul, and healthy for a sense of independence.
Yeah.
So it does tie in if you can see the connection. And I think it's one of those things where, like, let's face it, like most people reading that story, like, okay, so some people have 100% attendance rates, but I think we've normally done some slightly shady things. And it just starts to present you, like it starts to showcase more of the real you. And once people see more of the real you, that it's the entire foundation of how we build trust.
Yeah.
So the email series that I normally focus on is when people first opt in. I want to effectively pour cement around the relationship.
Yeah. By
telling my story. So I've kind of got to the situation now where I will normally create about. So I normally, if I'm working with a client, I normally aim to write 14 or 15 emails. My own email series has ended up being 18 emails. And the reason for that is because sometimes if you write an email, you realize that it needs to be split into 2 emails, because actually it's 2 different stories.
Yeah.
And if you end up with an email that's got 2 different stories, you always have to split them. It's always worth splitting them. I like writing 15 emails because it means that I have different implementation options. I can send an email a day for just over 2 weeks. I can send an email every other day for a month. I can send an email every weekday for 3 weeks or so. So it means that within the time frame of a month, I can sort of deliver this story that actually communicates my expertise and gets people to see my uniqueness and gets people to see my real value. I don't generally have series that run on longer than a month, because people kind of forget where you started with it. So I feel like a month is sort of like a nice maximum time frame to kind of wrap it up.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be that you have multiple versions of these series. So it might be that you have a series after people opt in, and then maybe you have another one that goes out, a few weeks later or a few months later even.
Yeah.
But I sort of like the idea. The other reason that I like writing 14 or 15 emails is, as long as I've done the research and the planning and I know what I want to say, I can write 5 emails in about half a day. As long as I'm focused and I'm not on Facebook and I'm not messing about and all of that. So really it's 3 lots. It's 3 lots of production for me, which feels more doable. Although something that I found actually is that like it's way easier for me to tell someone else's story than it is to tell my own.
Hmm.
It's harder to work on your own story, and I found this last year when I was working. So last year I decided to kind of rewrite my core story series, and like what would take, if I was writing 5 emails in a day for a client, then that would drop to like 1 or 2 for me,
Yep.
because I think it's worth appreciating that your story is quite a complicated thing. It's not a black and white thing. It's almost like a very complicated octopus that has different tentacles, different things that you might include, that you might not include. There's no one single, it's not like a linear path. There's different branches to it. There's different things that you might say that you might not say. Um, there isn't really like a correct way to tell it, even. Often the best way to tell it is to kind of think through, well, what are the main turning points? Like what are the most significant experiences that led you to a different trajectory?
Yeah.
Even though those experiences often aren't that, at the time, they might not have been that obvious. Often we just kind of fall into things.
Yeah.
So, there's this idea that story selection is critically important, and I don't actually think it is. I think an ability to make the story of some relevance to the reader is important.
Yeah.
So if you think about my sandwich analogy that we were talking about earlier, where you've got your story being the filling and your bread being the content, then you need to be able to link the story to the content. So it would be normal at some point for you to then end the email by delivering, the points of what you wanted to say.
Yeah.
And it can't be like a jarring switch between the two. Like there's a bit of finesse involved in that. The way to do it, incidentally, is to kind of end story on one idea and start the content on the same idea.
Yeah.
But actually, what you sort of find over time is that like story selection actually isn't the be all and end all. I don't think. Selecting vulnerable stories, I think, is important.
Yeah.
But the more vulnerable the story is, the harder it's going to be to tell. The more you'll second guess yourself. The more you'll almost talk yourself out of including it. And those are normally the most powerful emails. The ones that would build the most trust. And if you think about it, if you think about what all your competitors are sending out, like they are not putting their inner selves on the line like this.
Mm-hmm.
When you tell these stories, you are doing a very brave thing. And I think you need to, so I think you need to acknowledge that and accept that it's hard, and accept that you can only tell the stories that you're ready to tell. Not all of your stories are ready to tell, or maybe even will ever be ready to tell, and that's fine.
Yeah.
You can only tell stories that you're comfortable with.
Yeah. You can always take a stab at it too, and if it's not quite ready to go and you need to sit on it and think about it and keep refining it, then great, but at least you got it started.
Yeah. But there has to be the story in place, and the more you get used to telling stories, the more just kind of second nature it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I will do in an email series, so I distinguish between like the open sandwich format and the closed sandwich format. So the open sandwich just goes from filling to bread, so story to content. So you open the email with the story, you launch straight into the drama of the story, you pull the reader in, and then you transition to your content. That tends to work best with people who already know you quite well. When people have very first opted in, you might want to adopt the closed sandwich format instead, where you have literally a sentence or two of content at the top that gives the reader a clue as to where you're going with this. So I need to tell you about a time that I accidentally halved my cost per conversion on Google Ads. This is how it came about. And then you go into the story, but you've given me a clue as to where I'm going with it. And if people don't have the relationship with you yet, sometimes you need to drop that seed at the start, to get them to read the story. It's a story that builds the trust. but
Mhm.
but that only happens if they read the story in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite a useful tip.
Yeah.
Um, I think another thing that I probably run into with clients is it's easy to be a bit hard on yourself. um, this so if you write a story and you don't think it's much good, um, you're worried about the relevancy of it, then that's basically a normal response. That's a normal response. Like so there's a lot of I see a lot of interest in the marketing world in storytelling, but as a sort of fad or technique for kind of getting attention. I'm not really talking about it in that sense. I'm talking about it as a fundamental technique for delivering knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm talking about it on a much sort of deeper level. And I think that's kind of what I mean, if you sell based on your expertise, then you can try and convince people with logic, but they're not going to buy.
Yeah.
You can only build trust and get people to have a sales conversation with you based on emotion, and emotion is all about stories.
Yeah.
So as I see it, like I just don't think you have that much of an option.
Yeah.
It's but at the same time, for me, it's a rewarding thing to do. It's the most enjoyable part of my work is either working on my own story or better understanding my own story, because I'm always learning about my own story, because I have this perception of how my story is in my head.
Hmm.
I'm always kind of learning new things about that, and that's quite an interesting thing, because if you could learn more about yourself, then you'll write better emails overall, like a
Yeah.
solid grasp of who you are and where you come from and what your value is. That's only going to help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't really like. I think we've touched on this in a previous episode. About people telling these personal stories in Facebook ads, and it's obviously like an attention grabbing gimmick, like,
Hmm.
uh, um, and you know,
Well, I think it underscores something we've mentioned a number of times, which is that there's a sequence to all these things, right? Like, so, you and I are professional service providers, and our story only matters in that context. And so, like you said, anytime somebody first comes in contact with our story, it's not just, what I ate for lunch today. That's useless. But when it has a story and a bearing on them, hey, let me tell you about the time that I accidentally cut my CPA in half
yeah.
or doubled my revenue or whatever, people will be like, oh yeah, that's interesting. I definitely want to hear that. And then you spin along with the story, and you can make it as personal, as interesting, or attention getting, whatever you need to. And they still know the whole time, like, what you're doing. I think this is why storytelling becomes, like, I think you mentioned it, it's basically like the backbone. It's not the beginning, at least not always the beginning, and it's certainly not the end. We're not telling stories just to waste time. We hope that if you're doing this as a business, we hope that you're attracting customers and filtering and qualifying them, and eventually they're going to buy and work with us. But yeah, it's got its place, and the order, the context matters. And I agree. There's way too much. Where I went on vacation and what I ate for lunch and all that other kind of, or what I do or don't like. I mean, a little bit of that helps, maybe, it's kind of like a little salt on your food, but not too much. But when you open your Facebook newsfeed and you're trying to learn something that matters to your business, or well, who opens their newsfeed for that, right? But what I mean is, like, in general, you're carrying on throughout your day. What matters to you is growing your business. And you open that news feed and it's talking about somebody's lunch, who cares? Who cares? Especially when it's the 701st time, right?
Yeah. I think telling stories in warm Facebook ads where you're targeting a remarketing audience that is quite a warm remarketing audience. I mean, that's fine. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Absolutely.
Telling your story unsolicited to cold people who don't know who you are basically makes you like the crazy person on the bus who kind of sidles up to you and insists on telling you their life story, and you're like, oh my God, how am I going to get away from this person? So don't be like that person. I think another thing to think about is, if you just get into grips with this, then telling sort of deeply personal stories is quite an advanced thing, I think, and it's often easier to get going and get to grips with this by telling stories about the more direct line of events that led to your current expertise and your current line of work.
Yep.
If you get started with that, that's a relatively safe way to get started. It's not that much of a leap between that sort of story and your content.
Yeah.
So if that helps you get going, or if that's what you first introduce, people coming into your world to, then do that.
Yeah, I think you could almost say, I mean, you're the story writer, not me, but tell me what you think of this. I think you could almost say you've got to, when you're beginning, you've got to kind of introduce your story to yourself, right? And you may not get it at all right, certainly not, applicable and relevant to your audience, but you got to get it out there, and it's probably going to evolve over time. I know I haven't spent a lot of time working on my story, but as I have tried to describe to some clients, what I do, why I do it, and how I got here, some of them have actually asked me, like, what did you used to do? How'd you get into marketing? What made you the AdWords guy? And over time, as I've kind of told and retold that story, I found a little bit more concise and applicable way to describe how I got from IT to marketing. I think that would happen to just about anybody. You say it several times. You got to hear yourself say it out loud, or write it. Either way, you learn what parts are just not worth saying or not worth listening to, and what parts are salient, right? So your story kind of evolves over time.
I think to give people a few more specific tips. So yeah, it definitely does evolve over time, and as you tell it more, then it'll become more clear to you. A few things that are very important, especially in a written story. So in a written story, you have more time to kind of think about how you're going to word things. Often business stories do not contain enough bad things happening. So a good story has ups and it has downs, and that is the contrast in the story. And you need both ups and downs. Most business stories just have ups, and if you're only telling sweet and joyful, wonderful things to your customers, then you're basically treating them like children.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you think about it, like if you were like out in your yard just getting the mail or something, and like a ball bounces down, a ball comes over the fence and bounces into the road, and then a small toddler runs out running after the ball, and then a van comes around at the top of the road fast, and you think, oh no, there's going to be a crash here. Like, what sort of message do you shout out? It's not a positive, joyful message. It's a negative message because you're looking after people.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid of using negative messaging. Like most of the time, you're not being negative. You're just being responsible. But yeah, it's the contrast in the story that makes it interesting. If your stories are only just all the wonderful things that happen to you, like, first of all, that's really dull. People are not interested in that. People watch television programs for the drama, for the pain, the heartache. People want to read about your heartache because they see echoes of their own heartache echoed in that.
Yep.
So there has to be contrast. And if possible, there has to be, it can work really well to include suspense and dialogue.
Yeah.
Suspense and dialogue are quite often missing. So suspense is basically withholding the outcome of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Another common mistake I see people making is kind of commenting or reading in between the lines of the story as it's being told, or kind of interpreting the story for me as a reader. It's like, oh well, that was dangerous because blah blah blah. It's like, just don't say that. Let me come to that of my own
Yeah.
conclusions. So yeah, suspense works quite well. So often what I will do is I will open up my core story email series and I'll tell half of the story and I'll leave it on a cliffhanger and I'll continue that story in the next email. So that's sometimes called a soap opera sequence.
Yes.
I do not make significant use of soap opera sequences because I generally believe that each email should kind of stand on its own two legs. However, at the start of an email series, it can make a lot of sense to split a story across two, maybe three emails because you want to draw people in and you want to get people reading. It's like the Netflix effect. Like if you can get people reading the first three emails, they'll probably read the next 15.
Yeah.
Netflix know that. I forget the exact stats, but there's something to do with if you watch the first 3 or 4 episodes in a series on Netflix, like Netflix know that you'll probably watch the full box set. That's how it is. And it's the same with email. So adding that sort of suspense in quite early on can work. Don't take the reader's attention for granted, basically. Don't tell boring stories that only have wonderful things happening. Try to withhold the outcome a bit. Make use of dialogue. So if you read, most novels contain significant dialogue, and that's for a very good reason because dialogue pulls you into the story. It shows you it pulls you into the story rather than just telling you what happened in the story. So including dialogue in your emails is quite a sensible thing to do. And it doesn't have to be all dialogue, but occasional bits of dialogue really just help to keep the reader engaged.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I have, that's kind of like a headline tour of some of the key things to think about, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess something to say is that like I've actually written a book about this called Simple Story Selling. Cool. Which goes through all of my thoughts on this in a lot of detail. The other thing that I did in Simple Story Selling was that I also, so much after I went through Sean D'Souza's storytelling course, and I've been working on this for a while, a friend recommended that I read a book called The 7 Basic Plots by a guy called Christopher Booker. And, I'd sort of heard various opinions that there are X number of basic plots, or that all plots kind of like revolve around their so-called hero's journey or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'd always kind of dismissed it as a myth of categorization. What Christopher Booker does in his book is over about 900 pages. He analyzes all of the stories that he can find that have lasted over the last 2,000 years or so, going right back to the Epic of Gilgamesh,
yeah,
and coming right up to modern day. And what he concludes is that the stories that last all tend to follow the same plot structure, which broadly speaking is the hero's journey. You have the call in the beginning, you then have a sort of dream phase where things go well for a while. So if you think about like Lord of the Rings, like in the call phase, dark riders arrive in the Shire, and it's not possible for the hobbits to carry on living peacefully, basically. So that is the call. We then have a dream phase where they make pretty good progress for a while. We then have the frustration phase where they get all sorts of hold-ups and they get split up and they have to go through a mine and all that kind of stuff. There's then this sort of final climatic battle with the dark force in the story, and then there's the resolution. And actually all of the stories that last tend to follow this plot structure, even in like a comedy plot where the dark force in the story is confusion. You have the same sort of thing where like the resolution is people finally seeing each other for who they really are, and then you get the happy ending. Or in a tragedy plot, it's the same structure. Only the dark force in the story is also the hero of the story. So in Macbeth, for example, we have in the final stage, the Kingdom of Scotland returns to its state of parity. So it's the same plot structure, just told in different ways from different perspectives. And I was like, well, perhaps we could apply that to our emails.
Yeah.
So the first version of the book, I wanted to know, could I apply the different variations of that structure the book had identified to a single email? And the answer was that you could, but it felt a bit squished.
Yes.
It felt a bit squished. It felt like you were trying to condense, a 5-phase, quite nuanced 5-phase story into 800 words or 600 words or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I when I'm now constructing my core story series, I normally have that structure in the back of my mind, where if I'm telling my story about how I got to my current line of work, I might structure it so that maybe the core phase is, so in my story, for example, I was bored in a job. I felt like I needed a change. I decided to go self-employed. For a while, I had the dream phase where things went quite well. I managed to pick up a client. And then obviously the wheels fell off the bus. It all went horribly wrong. I ended up walking around shops, trying to speak to business owners, doing all sorts of daft things. And then I eventually, there's various sorts of, the fourth phase would be like the climatic points of resolution, which could have been me going to Sean D'Souza's storytelling workshop, for example. And then you have the resolution of how it currently is today. So if I was telling that story, I would try to fit it over, if I'm writing 15 emails, I will try to tell over the 15 emails, I will try to build in that story.
Yep.
And that gives it this sort of evergreen quality. So anyway, that's more advanced stuff. It's not stuff that has to be considered up front. Storytelling doesn't have to, I mean, we're all storytellers, basically. It's just that it gets, there's this perception that it's more complicated than it necessarily needs to be. And yeah, I mean, like anything, it can be quite complicated. And if you want to discuss, archetypal stories with me, and if you want to discuss character arcs with me, that we can go into all of that. I mean, I love talking about all of that stuff, but the most important thing is just to get going. And whatever story you can tell today is better than not telling a story at all. I mean, that's better than just giving people dry bread over and over.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the book is called Simple Storytelling, so I would urge everyone to go and grab a copy. It's on Amazon on paperback and Kindle.
Okay, cool. Yep. So here's one final question for you. Would you say that everybody has a core story? Well, there's no better way to say it than that, but they're one core story, and then any other additional bits of story should revolve around that.
We all have some kind of emotional wound, whether we like it or not, or admit it or not. So I believe that my emotional wound, so sometimes the emotional wound is an obvious thing, like the death of a parent or some kind of tragic event like that. Yeah. I had a sort of fairly, not to say boring upbringing, but like nothing bad happened like that, I guess. Yeah. So I've come to the assessment that my kind of emotional wound was when I was about 13. I stammered quite badly in a French class, and it completely knocked the stuffing out of me. And for a while, I completely shut down at school. I stopped participating. About a year after that happened, I managed to slip up because I can be quite eloquent when I want to be. Mm-hmm. And about a year later, I was nominated for a school elocution competition. Mm. And I was like, if you excuse my language for a minute, I was like, shit. that was what was going in my head. I was like, how do I get out of this?
Yeah.
And I probably wrongly decided to just hide out on the yard and not show up, basically. Which was the immature way to go about it. I mean, what I should have done was I should have told someone that I was struggling and that I needed help, but I didn't have that level of maturity to deal with it in that way.
Yeah.
But it took me a long time, and it played me for a long time. And I mean, it still does occasionally, but I kind of learn how to deal with it and own it and whatever. But yeah, I mean, so that kind of emotional wound. So I tell that story in my series, and it's that sort of thing that, like, if you can have the bravery to kind of address that, then that does create a powerful, compelling story. So I'd ever think about, well, if you had to identify at least one emotional wound, because I mean, we're all messed up in some way, and it's the ways that we're kind of quote unquote messed up that offer the greatest possible empathy connection with other people, if you're brave enough to tell people about it when they're engaged and ready to hear it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just have a think about that.
Makes good sense.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Story Copywriter podcast, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. When you sign up at storycopywriters.com/podcast, I'll also send you my 7-day storytelling crash course free by email. Please also make sure you've got a copy of my simple story selling book, which is available from Amazon in paperback and Kindle formats. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.